Thick gray fog swirled around the towering architecture of the Tempelhof Airport terminal as the roar of four massive engines cut through the silence. A Douglas C-54 Skymaster transport plane descended rapidly from the overcast sky, its landing gear extending like the talons of a giant bird of prey. Inside the cockpit, the pilot fought against exhaustion and poor visibility, gripping the yoke with white-knuckled intensity while scanning the instruments for altitude and speed. The runway lights flickered below, offering a narrow path to safety in the heart of a ruined city that was still smoldering from the devastation of World War II. This was not a combat mission involving bombs or paratroopers dropping into enemy territory, but a desperate delivery of flour and coal to keep 2 million people alive. Below the descending aircraft lay the shattered remains of Berlin, a city that had once been the capital of a terrifying empire, but was now a landscape of broken bricks and hollowed-out buildings. The streets were filled with mountains of rubble where starving citizens scavenged for scraps of wood or coal to heat their freezing apartments during the harsh winter months. Every landing at Tempelhof was a high-stakes gamble against the weather and mechanical failure, where a single mistake could result in a fiery catastrophe within the densely populated urban center. The pilots knew that if they failed, the people waiting on the ground would face starvation, and the fragile peace in Europe might shatter into a new global conflict involving nuclear weapons. As the wheels of the heavy transport plane screeched onto the perforated steel planking of the runway, a swarm of German workers and American trucks rushed forward to meet it. The engines had barely spooled down before the cargo doors were thrown open, revealing sacks of flour and crates of dried milk stacked to the ceiling. This frantic activity was the heartbeat of the Berlin Airlift, a logistical miracle that defied all expectations and military doctrine of the time. For the people of West Berlin, the sound of these engines was not a noise of war, but a symphony of hope that signaled they had not been abandoned by the outside world. The successful landing was just one of hundreds that would occur that day in a relentless rhythm. To understand this moment, one must look back to the spring of 1948, when the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union had completely disintegrated. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, with the capital city of Berlin nestled deep inside the Soviet zone. The city itself was also divided into sectors, but it was an island of Western influence surrounded by a Red Sea of Soviet military control. Tensions rose as the Western Allies introduced a new currency called the Deutschmark to stabilize the economy in their zones, a move that threatened to undermine the Soviet plan for a unified communist Germany. The stage was set for a confrontation. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, viewed the presence of the Western Allies in Berlin as a direct threat to Soviet security and a hindrance to his expansionist goals in Europe. He believed that if he could force the Americans, British, and French out of Berlin, the entire city would fall under Soviet control, giving him leverage over the future of Germany. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet authorities announced that due to technical difficulties, all road and rail traffic between West Germany and West Berlin would be suspended indefinitely. This was a calculated blockade designed to starve the city into submission by cutting off its supply lines for food, coal, and electricity. The 2 million residents of West Berlin were trapped. The situation inside the blockaded sectors became critical almost immediately as power plants ran out of coal and food stocks began to dwindle rapidly. The Soviet administration cut off the electricity supply from East Berlin, leaving the western sectors in darkness for most of the day, and halting essential services like water pumps and sewage treatment. Panic began to spread through the population as memories of the recent war and the brutal winter of 1947 were still fresh in their minds. The Western Allies faced a seemingly impossible choice: either surrender the city to Soviet control and lose all credibility in Europe, or risk a Third World War by attempting to break the blockade with an armed convoy. In Washington and London, military planners and politicians debated their options with growing desperation as the clock ticked down on the food supplies in Berlin. General Lucius Dubignon-Clay, the military governor of the United States Zone in Germany, was a man of iron will and unshakable determination who refused to back down. He argued that abandoning Berlin would lead to the collapse of democracy in Europe, and give the Soviet Union a green light for further aggression. However, his proposal to send an armed convoy up the Autobahn was rejected by President Harry S. Truman, who feared it would trigger a war that the United States was not ready to fight. Instead, a third option emerged from the chaos. The only remaining access to Berlin was through 3 narrow air corridors that had been agreed upon by the Allied powers in 1945. These invisible highways in the sky were 20 miles wide and connected Berlin to the western zones of occupation like lifelines. General Lucius Dubignon-Clay believed that if the roads and rails were blocked, the sky remained open and could be used to supply the city. It was a concept that had never been tested on such a massive scale, and many experts believed it was mathematically impossible to fly in the thousands of tons of supplies needed daily. Nevertheless, with no other viable options available, the order was given to launch a massive airlift operation. General Lucius Dubignon-Clay contacted General Curtis LeMay, the commander of the United States Air Forces in Europe, to ask if his planes could carry coal to the besieged city. LeMay was initially skeptical about the feasibility of supplying an entire metropolis by air, but he mobilized his fleet of Douglas C-47 Skytrain transports immediately. These aircraft were veterans of the recent war, sturdy and reliable, but limited in their cargo capacity compared to newer models. On June 26, 1948, the first flights of what the Americans called Operation Vittles took off from bases in West Germany, carrying milk, flour, and medicine to the desperate citizens of Berlin. The operation had officially begun. The early days of the airlift were chaotic and disorganized, as pilots flew around the clock with little coordination or ground support. The infrastructure at Tempelhof Airport was woefully inadequate for the volume of traffic, and the grass runways at Gatto Airport in the British sector were quickly turned into mud. Yet despite the confusion, the sight of American and British planes landing in the city brought a wave of relief to the Berliners, who gathered on rooftops to watch. The British launched their own effort named Operation Planefair, and soon the skies over Berlin were filled with a motley collection of aircraft, including bombers converted into freighters. The challenge was immense, but the resolve of the Allied forces was stronger. General Lucius Dubignon-Clay knew that for the airlift to succeed, he needed more than just determination. He needed a logistical genius to organize the flow of aircraft. He called upon Major General William Tunner, a master of air transport who had successfully managed the perilous hump airlift over the Himalayas during the war against Japan. Tunner arrived in Berlin and immediately imposed a strict rhythm on the operation, creating a conveyor belt in the sky. He mandated that aircraft fly at specific altitudes and speeds, arriving over the radio beacons at precise intervals to maximize the number of landings. If a pilot missed his landing approach, he was ordered to fly back to West Germany, fully loaded rather than disrupt the flow. Under the command of Major General William Tunner, the efficiency of the airlift improved dramatically, and the tonnage of supplies delivered to Berlin began to climb steadily. He introduced larger aircraft like the Douglas C-54 Skymaster, which could carry 3 times the load of the older C-47s and were faster to unload. The ground crews were organized into highly efficient teams of German civilians who took great pride in their role in saving their own city. They raced against the clock to unload the planes in record time, often clearing 10 tons of coal in less than 20 minutes, so the aircraft could return to the air. The noise of engines became the constant soundtrack of life in West Berlin. The physical toll on the pilots and air crews was immense as they flew multiple missions a day, often grabbing sleep on stacks of cargo while the planes were reloaded. They battled fatigue, mechanical problems, and the ever-present danger of Soviet fighter planes that buzzed the transport corridors to intimidate them. Despite the harassment, the Allied pilots maintained their discipline and refused to be baited into a confrontation that could lead to war. The bond between the former enemies grew stronger with every flight as American and British airmen realized they were saving the very people they had bombed just a few years earlier. It was a profound shift in the psychological landscape of post-war Europe. Among the thousands of pilots flying the corridors was a young American lieutenant named Gale Halvorsen, who would become the most famous face of the entire operation. One day, while filming planes landing at Tempelhof, he walked over to a fence where a group of German children were watching the aircraft with wide eyes. He was struck by their politeness and the fact that they did not beg for chocolate or gum unlike children in other parts of Europe. Touched by their dignity, Halvorsen reached into his pocket and handed them 2 sticks of gum, which they divided into tiny pieces to share among themselves. He promised them that he would drop more candy from his plane on his next flight. True to his word, Lieutenant Gale Halvorsen attached chocolate bars and gum to small handkerchief parachutes and dropped them from the flare chute of his C-54 as he approached the runway. The children on the ground spotted the plane by the wiggling of its wings, a signal Halvorsen had agreed upon, and raced to catch the falling treasures. The gesture was a violation of military regulations, but the joy it brought to the children of Berlin was undeniable. Soon other pilots joined in, and the operation became known as Little Vittles, spreading goodwill and hope throughout the beleaguered city. Halvorsen became known affectionately as the Candy Bomber or Uncle Wiggly Wings by the German children. The story of the Candy Bomber captured the hearts of people back in the United States, and donations of candy and handkerchiefs poured in from across the country. It was a public relations coup that humanized the airlift and solidified support for the operation among the American public, who saw their airmen as heroes of compassion. For the children of Berlin, the falling parachutes were a symbol that the world had not forgotten them, and that their former enemies were now their protectors. The simple act of kindness by Gale Halvorsen did more to win the hearts and minds of the German people than any diplomatic speech or treaty could ever achieve. It turned the roar of engines into a promise of friendship. As summer turned to autumn, the Allied planners faced a terrifying new enemy in the form of the approaching German winter, which threatened to ground the fleet. Berlin winters were notoriously harsh, with thick fog, freezing rain, and low clouds that could shut down flight operations for days at a time. The Soviet leadership was counting on the weather to defeat the airlift, believing that the Allies would not be able to sustain the tonnage needed to heat the city. General Lucius Dubignon-Clay and his staff worked feverishly to stockpile coal and food, knowing that a few days of bad weather could deplete the reserves and lead to disaster. The stakes had never been higher as the first snows began to fall. To increase the capacity of the airlift, the French authorities in Berlin offered a plot of land in their sector to build a new airport named Tegel. The construction of Tegel Airport was a monumental feat of engineering and human effort, involving thousands of German laborers working around the clock. Without heavy machinery available in the blockaded city, the workers used hand tools and wheelbarrows to clear the land and lay the runway foundation. Buildings that obstructed the flight path were demolished, including a Soviet radio tower that was blown up by French engineers, much to the fury of the Soviet command. In just 90 days, the new airport was operational, providing a crucial third valve for the flow of supplies. The winter of 1948 proved to be one of the foggiest on record, causing frequent delays and forcing pilots to fly on instruments for hours on end. There were tragic accidents where planes crashed into the woods or slammed into buildings while attempting to land in zero visibility conditions. Dozens of American and British airmen lost their lives during the operation, paying the ultimate price to keep the city of Berlin alive. Yet despite the losses and the grueling conditions, the airlift continued with a relentless determination that stunned the Soviet observers. The pilots flew through blizzards and gales, guided by the steady voice of the air traffic controllers at Tempelhof and Gatow. Inside Berlin, the residents endured the cold and hunger with a stoic resilience that earned the respect of the world. They lived on dehydrated potatoes and powdered eggs, rationing every lump of coal to keep their children warm in the unheated apartments. The trees in the Tiergarten Park were chopped down for fuel, and the city was enveloped in a perpetual gloom of darkness and cold. Yet the spirit of the Berliners remained unbroken, and they refused to give in to the Soviet pressure to register for food rations in the East. They knew that their freedom depended on the success of the airlift, and they were willing to suffer to maintain their independence from communist rule. The turning point of the operation came in the spring of 1949, when the weather began to improve and the efficiency of the airlift reached its peak. Major General William Tunner decided to stage a demonstration of air power to show the Soviets that the airlift could be sustained indefinitely. He organized the Easter Parade, a maximum effort operation designed to break all previous tonnage records within a single 24-hour period. On April 16, 1949, the skies over Berlin were filled with a continuous stream of aircraft landing almost every minute at the three airports. The ground crews worked with frantic energy, unloading coal and flour at a pace that seemed impossible. By the end of the Easter Parade, the Allied forces had delivered nearly 13,000 tons of supplies to Berlin in a single day, exceeding the daily rail tonnage before the blockade. It was a staggering achievement that shattered the Soviet hope of starving the city into submission and proved the airlift was a permanent solution. The roar of the planes was deafening and triumphant, a clear message to Joseph Stalin that the Western powers were in Berlin to stay. The morale of the Berliners soared to new heights, while the Soviet leadership realized that their blockade had become a humiliating failure. The technological and logistical might of the West had overcome the geographical advantage of the East. Following the success of the Easter Parade, it became clear to the Soviet Union that the blockade was not achieving its political objectives and was instead uniting the West. The counter-blockade imposed by the Western Allies on East Germany was also hurting the Soviet zone economy, causing shortages of steel and coal. Secret negotiations began between the United States and the Soviet Union to find a face-saving way to end the confrontation and lift the siege. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet authorities announced that the blockade of Berlin would be lifted and that road and rail traffic could resume. The news spread through Berlin like wildfire, sparking celebrations in the streets. When the first British convoy drove through the Soviet zone and arrived in West Berlin, it was greeted by cheering crowds throwing flowers and waving flags. The barriers were removed and the electricity was turned back on, bringing light to the city after 11 months of darkness. However, General Lucius Dubignon Clay ordered the airlift to continue for several more months to build up a massive reserve of supplies in case the Soviets changed their minds. The flights continued until September 30, 1949, ensuring that the city would be prepared for any future attempt to strangle it. The Berlin Airlift had officially ended as a resounding victory for the Western Allies. The legacy of the Berlin Airlift extended far beyond the immediate survival of the city and the defeat of the Soviet blockade. It marked the first major confrontation of the Cold War and set the pattern for the decades of tension that would follow between East and West. The operation transformed the relationship between the Germans and the Western Allies, turning occupiers into protectors and enemies into friends. The shared sacrifice of the pilots and the Berliners forged a bond of trust that would become the foundation of the new West German state. It demonstrated that the democratic nations had the will and the capacity to defend their values against aggression without resorting to war. The airlift also hastened the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as the Western powers realized the need for a collective defense alliance. The success of the operation proved that air power could be used as a strategic instrument of foreign policy, capable of projecting influence and sustaining populations. The ruins of Berlin became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, and the city itself became a beacon of freedom deep behind the Iron Curtain. The candy dropped by Gail Halvorsen and the coal hauled by weary pilots had purchased the liberty of 2 million people. It was a victory of logistics, humanity, and endurance. Today at the former Tempelhof Airport, a monument stands reaching toward the sky with 3 prongs representing the 3 air corridors used during the airlift. It is a tribute to the 79 people who lost their lives during the operation, including American, British, and German citizens. The names of the fallen are inscribed on the base of the monument, reminding visitors of the high price paid for the freedom of the city. The Berlin Airlift remains one of the greatest humanitarian operations in history, a moment when machines of war were used to save lives rather than take them. It stands as a testament to what can be achieved when nations unite for a common cause. The story of the Berlin Airlift is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can descend from the skies on the wings of a transport plane. It showed the world that the resolve of free people is stronger than any blockade, and that the hunger for liberty cannot be extinguished by force. As the sun sets over the modern city of Berlin, the memory of the roaring engines and the cheering children lives on in the hearts of the people. The operation that kept a city alive also kept the dream of a free Europe alive during its most fragile hour. It was a triumph of the human spirit that will echo through the whispers of time forever.